Indeed. Well, I'm Alberto Gomes, and I'm an emeritus professor in anthropology at La Trobe University. And at the moment, I'm also the global director of the DEEP network, DEEP standing for Dialogue, Empathic Engagement and Peace Building. Much of my work is focused on Malaysian Aboriginal people, anthropological research, but I've also done some work on cultural politics in Malaysia, as well as Goa in India. Right. I don't think it's really an homogenization of the different Asli groups, or in this pan-Asal group, but it is really a coalition. It's bringing different groups of people who are, Malaysian Aboriginal, people from Sabah and Sarawak, and it's a matter of coming together because many of these Asli groups are in some way or the other marginalized in Malaysia, and so it is essentially a group of people coming together because of various sorts of shared politics and also working together in the collaborative way in terms of trying to to come up with better sort of lives for themselves. Personally, I think that it's not really possible for anyone to lose one's culture, because what happens is that culture is something that's dynamic, but it's also important to keep in mind that rather than losing one's culture, there is a strong possibility that one will gain new cultural practices and new cultural beliefs. So I think this notion that one can actually lose one's culture is problematic. But however, there are certain practices that Malaysian Aboriginal people might have which might be difficult to practice at the moment, given that many of them have been removed from their forest areas, and certain beliefs that they have that are connected and associated with their lives in the forest might be difficult to continue in a different kind of lifestyle. So yes, you might think that they may have lost certain aspects of those cultures, but I don't think they would have in any way lost their culture. And the other thing to also keep in mind is that Malaysian Aboriginal people culture is very dynamic. It is also a culture that's growing, and the Malaysian Aboriginal culture tends to be very inclusive. So they would adopt certain kinds of cultural practices from other groups of people in Malaysia and incorporate that into their own culture. I think it's important to keep in mind that the resettlement programs that the Malaysian government has undertaken for Orang Asli groups, these resettlement programs were supposed to be for the betterment of the Orang Asli, and in many cases, these projects were undertaken alongside with a number of different development and economic projects. However, one also needs to consider the fact that Malaysian Aboriginal people have been displaced as a result of many of these resettlement projects. At times, these projects are carried out in areas where Orang Asli lands have been used for various other purposes. So you have Felda land schemes that have been carried out in certain Orang Asli areas where Orang Asli have been resettled away from that land. You have logging that have taken place in some parts of Malaysia. Once again, Orang Asli have been displaced. We have various large infrastructural projects. For example, University Kebangsaan Malaysia is located on what used to be Orang Asli land. We also have the KLIA airport. One of the runways goes right across Orang Asli land. So one has to ask this question, in fact, is there always the fact that Orang Asli have gained economically or socially from resettlement programs? The other thing to also keep in mind is that many of these resettlement programs have been adopted as a result of security issues. So in the past, Malaysian Aboriginal people were enticed to move away from the homelands and to live in these resettlement projects, primarily because the government forces wanted to deny the commoners of the support of Malaysian Aboriginal people, especially those people that live in the forest and in the jungle, which is where the commoners' activities were conducted. So for national security reasons. But you also have Orang Asli that have been resettled for the construction of dams, for example, where their lands have been flooded. So I wouldn't say that resettlement is always for the benefit of the Orang Asli. In fact, I would even be bold enough to say that, and contentious, to say that resettlement has actually brought much greater problems to the Orang Asli. And my research and my studies, in fact, have indicated that. I don't think Orang Asli can be left alone because, first of all, we have to keep in mind that Orang Asli have never been alone. They've never lived in, although one would believe that they have lived in remote areas and isolated. But you know that the Orang Asli have been involved in the trading of forest products ever since the 1st century AD. So they have in fact been trading with Arab and Indian traders in supplying a lot of the different kinds of products, spices and various sorts of products from the forest. So there's a very long-standing trading relations that Orang Asli have held with people from the outside. But so I think it's in a way, it is a misconception to say that Orang Asli are isolated. So they've never been left alone, and they don't want to be left alone. We also have to keep in mind that the reason that many Orang Asli live in remote and isolated places is because many of them have been the victims of slave raiding. In the past, they've been taken as slaves, and for Orang Asli there is a very strong fear of the outside world, primarily because they see people who come from the outside world as potential slave raiders. Now, taking that into consideration, we have to perhaps understand, from the perspective of the Orang Asli, what they've had to go through in terms of the various sorts of in their history, slave raiding, exploitation from outside people. Well, first of all, we have to keep in mind the fact that Orang Asli have always had connections with the outside world, connections with other people. In fact, many of the Orang Asli have married. There are non-Orang Asli that have married into Orang Asli communities. So you have Malays, Chinese, Indians who have in fact taken Orang Asli as their partners and live with Orang Asli. So Orang Asli are very inclusive in that sense. But the other thing to also consider is that we tend to make this distinction between Orang Asli and non-Orang Asli. Wherever we have this problem of the Orang Asli, I think this distinction that we make tends to be unhelpful, primarily because I think it's important that all Malaysians should be concerned of the fact that there is a group of people like the Orang Asli who have been marginalized. The marginality is reflected in the life expectancy, reflected in the incidence of disease found in these many Orang Asli. It is also reflected in the impoverishment of Orang Asli in terms of the poor diet and nutrition that they have. So all these various factors, they come in, and I think all Malaysians would need to, in fact, not be concerned about this, dualism or this kind of distinction that's made between Orang Asli and non-Orang Asli. Everyone should be concerned about the fact that there is a group of people like the Orang Asli who have been marginalized, they have been discriminated and treated unequally in this country. So while yes, of course, the Orang Asli are different, but we also have to keep in mind that the Orang Asli are the first peoples of Malaysia. They are the indigenous peoples in this country. The question that you've just asked is a question that is commonly asked by many Malaysians. They say, oh, we do not know much about the Orang Asli. But because they are private or they don't talk about themselves, or we don't hear their voices. And the reason we don't hear the voices is because they haven't had the opportunity to express their voices much. And furthermore, often, when you have media attention or when you have someone goes in with a television camera to document the lives of the Orang Asli, they often document to present a very exotic aspect of the Orang Asli. And what's missing here is that their cultural, the very rich, cultural stories, the narratives, the various beliefs and value systems that they have. And I think that's really missing. The other thing too is that there is a lot of material available on the Orang Asli. Lots of books have been written. For example, I've written 3 books on the Orang Asli. Many of my fellow anthropologists have written books. There is even an Orang Asli author, okay, Akia. And Akia has written several novels drawing from his experiences in the Orang Asli. But I don't think that many people know about him. There are several fabulous Orang Asli leaders, like Ba Tony, like Zanisa, and Tija, and they all have, on a consistent basis, they have been writing about the Orang Asli. They've been writing both in English and as well as in Bahasa Malaysia. But the unfortunate thing is that very few people actually access that kind of work and the work that they've. And and I'm so pleased that you asked me this question, because I would invite you, to go and listen to the Orang Asli, listen to their stories, and perhaps, even have, if you get the opportunity, to go and visit them, or even invite them, to come and give talks at a university or anywhere. And I think they have spoken for a very long time. And I also find it a problem sometimes that it's often anthropologists like myself, that talk about the Orang Asli, and I think I shouldn't be speaking on behalf of the Orang Asli. Orang Asli should speak for themselves. However, as an anthropologist, I also have an important responsibility to, as far as I can, to alert people to create an awareness of people like the Orang Asli. So my very seemed like a very long answer to your question, but I think no, Orang Asli have lots of stories to tell, and it's just that we haven't been listening. I don't think we see them as the other, because for example, in your case, if someone belongs to, say, a Malay community, then there is the possibility that the Chinese would be the other, or the Indian would be the other. Now, the very fact that you consider the Orang Asli to be the other itself is troubling, because then you are saying that the Orang Asli is, someone that's different from the other Malaysians in the country. Perhaps let's think of ways of how we consider Orang Asli to be like us. Firstly, they are Malaysian citizens. They are, the first peoples of Malaysia. They are, people that we should respect, and they are, people that are entitled to a much better life than they have at the moment. And rather than thinking of them as other, let's think of them as being one of us, who have been, unfortunately been disadvantaged and marginalized. When we look at the new economic policy, when it was first enunciated in 1970, it was guided by two very important principles of the NEP. One is to eradicate poverty, and the second is to redistribute, to have some kind of redistribution, to ensure that everyone in the country, so that there was no imbalance and inequality. So in other words, to eradicate poverty and to eradicate the inequality that seems to have been considered to be based on race. Now, the unfortunate thing is that the Orang Asli, although they are Bumiputra in that sense, when the NEP was first, when was first implemented, and rightfully they should have been given a number of different kinds of benefits from the NEP. They have, but however, some of these benefits, so-called benefits, have actually been provided to the Orang Asli through programs like the resettlement. So let's take the resettlement for example as a case. You take people away from their homeland, you displace them, they had access to much larger areas in the past, and now you localize them into much smaller areas. And the question that one needs to ask is that also in many cases the land that have been provided to them not of very good quality land, not very good fertile soils. And so in the process, Orang Asli have become increasingly impoverished, impoverished as a result. So when you look at the rest of the country, you find that the gap between the non-Orang Asli and the Orang Asli have in fact widened. So you find that Malay communities have the conditions have improved. So have the conditions in the Indian communities, and so have the conditions in the Chinese communities. And definitely that these communities have, in many ways, have benefited from the progress that one sees in Malaysia. But the gap is stark between the Orang Asli and the non-Orang Asli. Poverty exists in all the different groups in the country. And when we speak about the country, it is not just Peninsular Malaysia that we should be concerned about. Poverty exists in Sabah and Sarawak. Impoverishment continues in so many of these kinds of communities. But what we find is that the NEP seems to have benefited. And even among the Malay poor, I don't think that all the Malay, the people who are, poor in these various Malay kampungs have in fact benefited as much as, say, some other communities who have had the access to these various public goods that were available and offered through the NEP. I would disagree with any policy that would continue. I think the policy should be driven primarily by the concern of poverty. So I would find it really problematic if any of the policies that come are developed on the basis of race. So in this case, if my objection to any kind of policy towards Orang Asli, the objection is on the basis of race. So you have, for example, although this is very rare in the Orang Asli case, but you might have rich Orang Asli, and if you have a policy that's targeted, a policy that is for a whole community, then my question here is that do the rich Orang Asli, although as I said, this is not probably applicable to the Orang Asli, but do the rich Orang Asli then would feel entitled to the various kinds of economic benefits that are being provided? So an NEP, indeed. Affirmative action, yes, but the affirmative action should go to people who really need the support that society can provide them, and particularly in terms of trying to eradicate poverty and trying to remove the imbalance that exists in society, trying to wipe out any form of inequality in the country. So yes, of course, if you're going to have a policy, Orang Asli being the most disadvantaged, most marginalized, impoverished people in this country, yes, they would certainly, should be the beneficiaries of any kind of, developmental project. My view on this is that the neoliberal policy is flawed. Okay, it's in the sense that it promotes competition, where we find that this heightened sense of competition tends to in fact bring about much greater problems in the world that we are living today. So perhaps we should think differently. How can we now change society, transform it in such a way that people are inclined to cooperate, inclined to work together, and have kind of sharing relations, exchanges, which is for mutual benefit rather than competition and one group dominating over another group. So I think in this sense, rather than us trying to teach the Orang Asli or trying to inculcate in the Orang Asli a sense of competition or competitive spirit, I think perhaps we should try to consider changing ourselves. Rather than being overly competitive, we should now start thinking of being more cooperative, because for the various global solutions that we are seeking today, whether it's ecological, whether it's to do with collective violence, I think it's really important that we have to work together. We can't afford to compete. We can't afford to be pitted against one another. So let's look at ways of how we can bring Orang Asli's strong sense of cooperation into the mainstream rather than the reverse, of taking the idea of competition, which is found in the mainstream, into the Orang Asli communities. I just mentioned one in regard to competition and cooperation. Let me mention another one to do with being in touch with nature, being a kind of having a very intimate connection with the environment. So when we look at that, for example, we find that in the world that we are living in today, we seem to have been detached from nature. We have become ecological criminals by the way we treat the environment in such a deplorable way. And I think humans as a species are not going to survive much longer if we continue living in the way that we do live. So Orang Asli, strong sense of connection with nature, the fact that they are ecocentric in their perspective, the fact that they treat the environments with a great deal of respect, and furthermore they also live within their means, they live sustainable lives. I think all these various lessons, much of my previous work has been about the Orang Asli, writing about their culture, writing about their economic practices, writing about their political structure and systems. But now, for the last 10 years, I should say, my focus has been on how one can learn from the Orang Asli. So I do less work, I write less about the Orang Asli, and I do more about how one might learn the rich lessons that we can gain from the Orang Asli and other indigenous peoples.